Welcome viewers, in today's episode. r/AskReddit. What's the most horrible way to die that you've ever heard of that has actually happened? There was a comment on here about a worker at a steelworks who committed suicide by jumping in the molten steel crucible. Because it was liquid, he expected to drown in it, unaware that the density of molten metal is the same as solid metal, so he just skittered across the surface and fried to death. Brutal. Even if he wanted to drown, there are so many less molten things to drown in first. And even if you're really set on being a unique sort of suicide, there's always mercury, molasses, lubricant, swimming pool full of jello, holy water, gallium, alcohol, formaldehyde, gasoline. Like, come on now. I used to work in a steel mill. I can't recall the lingo, but after molten steel was poured into the huge vats and then emptied, you'd need a couple guys to hop in and scrape the inside to get the remnants out. One time there was a miscommunication of some kind and 3 guys had molten steel poured onto them. One survived. That guy that got stuck upside down in the cave for like 2 days. I came here to post this poor bastard. The worst part was they almost had him out, but then fucking dropped him and he got stuck even more firmly. That guy that walked 700 meters off the boardwalk in Yellowstone with his sister and slipped into a boiling, acidic geyser comes to mind. That guy who jumped in a boiling geyser to save his dog also comes to mind. When they pulled him out, he had third-degree burns over 100% of his body while he was still alive and conscious enough to realize he fucked up. When his friend pulled him out, he said something along the lines of, "That was stupid. How bad am I? I'm an idiot." Like, even though his nerve endings were probably shot pretty instantly once he was in there, the idea that he was able to realize that he was going to die is fucked up. I remember reading that they tried to take his shoes off and it completely degloved his foot. And that the boiling water instantly blinded him too. Horrific way to die. Dude tries to blow his head off with a shotgun. The first shot just blows most of his jaw off, but he lives. He gets up, walks to the bathroom mirror, looks at himself, reloads and finishes the job. That moment of looking in the mirror must have been pure hell. Particularly horrible considering a majority of suicide attempts the person decides they want to live when it's too late. It's sad to think after the first shot did he change his mind, but then saw his face and thought fuck it, as he's just made his situation worse. Yeah, a girl I went to high school with attempted suicide by jumping off the top of Castle Craig. She survived, and said that she regretted jumping the instant she was airborne. I've heard that most jump suicide survivors say the same thing, if not all. Edit, for those asking, she sustained some injuries, but nothing too permanent as far as I'm aware. A good amount of hospital time was required, but after some recovery, she was okay. I didn't find out about her attempt until a few years after it happened, as I was never close with her. She was friends with my ex, which is how I know what I know. There's forest directly underneath the cliff face upon which the castle sits, so I always just assumed the trees caught her and broke her fall. Vlad the Impaler didn't stab a massive hole in you to prop you up on the stake. No, they shoved it up your asshole. Your intestines would be rearranged and eventually you would die of either sepsis or dehydration. I was going to say this one, they'd make it so you were impaled just on the tips of your toes, and as you weakened and got more tired, you would essentially impale yourself as your legs began to give out. Girl's hair got caught in a lathe and pulled her in. She was alone in the machine shop at night and the lathe kept spinning what was left of her around until people came in the following morning. 2 universal rules of machine shops: never be in the shop on your own and never have loose clothing or hair. Tuck that shit back. My friend worked on the liver ward at the hospital. If you are suicidal and overdose on Panadol, Tylenol, it takes 3 days to die in extreme pain. She said they would have people in weekly who had taken a Panadol, Tylenol overdose and by the time they got to the ward they had changed their mind, so this person who now wanted to live died an agonizing death filled with shame in front of their friends and relatives. TLDR, don't overdose on Panadol, Tylenol. Edit, PSA, do not mention drugs that others have successfully OD'd on. There are some very successful OD drugs that are not well known and it is better to keep it that way. They can't pump your stomach for that? Time is an important factor. The longer it is in the system the more damage done, so if you ever think someone has taken too many, do not waste a single second getting them to a hospital. My aunt died in a car fire. She was driving drunk and went off the road and crashed her car. A fire started and the car was damaged to point where she could not exit. Firefighters arrived and one tried to pull her out by her arm but only got skin. It's awful to think about. Similar thing happened to a friend of mine. Many years ago when she was a toddler, she was in the car with her mother. They were in an accident and the car was wrecked. Her mum couldn't get out when a fire started. The mum climbed into the back seats and cloaked her body over that of my friend's. By the time emergency services got there, the mum was gone and my friend survived, but she was badly injured with burns over the majority of her body. Severe radiation poisoning is pretty horrifying. It can take up to 2 weeks to kill you, during which time your body will fall apart at the molecular level while you're still alive. In some cases they can't even give you effective painkillers because your veins become so fragile they can't handle an injection. Oh, and just to fuck with you, you'll start to feel better after a couple days, but that's just the calm before your skin starts to die. The firefighter from Chernobyl. Ignatenko. I still feel like throwing up when I think about his final form. There was a Japanese, I think, guy who got super irradiated, and to study the effects they did everything they could to keep him alive despite him begging to die. I think it was after he died for the 4th time that they were unable to bring him back. Absolutely awful. You are correct. They were pumping him full of meds to keep him alive as long as possible. His cells were literally dead and his white blood cell count dropped to 0, his body was already failing from day 1. His skin continued to melt off, multiple infections, heart attacks and seizures constantly. In the end, they really didn't even get that much useful data out of him, it was a complete waste. I really do believe this may be the worst one, even beyond scaphism. Or there's always being skinned alive, aka flaying. Generally the victim starts with being left naked out in the hot sun for a day or 2 in order to get severe sunburn. If it's winter or just bad weather, a quick dunk in boiling water does the same thing. They're then strung up by the hands and a very sharp knife is used to make long straight incisions. The burn helps separate the skin from the underlying connective tissue. The skin is then peeled off from the muscle in large sheets using a hot knife. Between the burn and the hot knife, a skilled flayer could remove the skin with minimal blood loss, meaning the victim did not bleed out. Most common actual cause of death would then be hypothermia, as the skin is a vitally important part of your body's ability to regulate its temperature, or if they were super unlucky they'd die of sepsis, blood poisoning due to infection, as much as days later. And of course the victim would be kept conscious during the entire procedure. There was a video on WPD of a guy who jumped off a building to kill himself. He landed on a bollard which broke his fall enough to keep him conscious while dying of impalement. This one is rough, very little gore, but he's basically sitting on the ground and you can see the pole bulging out his neck skin. Horrible way to die. Poor guy wanted an easy way out. The Idaho National Lab incident. The No. 7 shield plug from the top of the reactor vessel impaled the third man through his groin and exited his shoulder, pinning him to the ceiling. I read a story about a man trying to rob a place by crawling through a sewer pipe. He became lodged in it with his hands around his waist trying to squirm through a narrow part. The rats found him. Actually, just his face. They used his face as a buffet for days. There were a few dead rats around that he'd bitten to death because he couldn't use his hands. Other rats arrived to partake of the feast, he did not make it. Knew a guy in the Navy who said he saw someone get cut in half by a snapped cable. He was still alive for about a minute after it happened apparently. In Afghanistan there was a 12-year-old girl, 14 years old max, that poured gasoline over herself and set herself on fire, because her parents were forcing her to marry a 60-ish-year-old man. Worst part about it is not being able to do anything to help her. This story is extremely disturbing and sad. Back when I was in 7th grade, I had this friend, Lazar, who was a year older than me. He had 3 siblings, 2 of which were much younger. He also lived pretty close to where I lived. It's important to note that we live on the countryside. One day, while we're at school, the principal and the teachers are freaking out, kids are starting to cry. I asked one of the kids what happened, and I just stood there horrified for a moment. Turns out that Lazar's father was out on the field on a combine harvester working with his friend, when something got stuck in the rotary thresher. Lazar's dad went back there to check it out, but after a while his friend thought that he was done and just decided to turn the harvester back on. However, his leg sleeve got caught up in the thresher and started to quickly pull him in, basically crushing his leg and soon enough, his other leg as well. By the time his friend heard the screams and stopped the harvester, both of his legs were ripped off of his body and crushed completely, only his upper half was left. His own son, Lazar, had to pick up what was left of his father and carry him to the car to get him to hospital immediately. His youngest child was there, watching all of this unfold, but I don't think he could comprehend it at the time. Having lived very far away from the nearest hospital, they had to basically meet the ambulance halfway there in order to not lose any precious time since his father, by some miracle, was still alive, though unconscious. All the way there, his own son had to hold him in his arms and wrap him in his clothing and using his belt trying desperately to stop the bleeding as much as he could. You can imagine how much this fucked him up. His father passed away, a few hours later if I remember correctly, and I was at school when this happened. There was a Roman execution technique known as the body of death. For anyone interested, this is actually the allusion that the Apostle Paul makes in his letter to the Romans by saying, "Who shall free me from this body of death?" The punishment was often given to murderers, and it consisted of the body of the murdered victim being sewn onto the back of the murderer. Over time, the rot, disease, maggots, etc. would move from the corpse into the living person's body, slowly killing them. Furthermore, anyone caught trying to help the person being punished would be subject to the same punishment. This is why Rome was truly the most metal empire to exist. Since someone already said scaphism, my second worst one is strychnine poisoning. It can be inhaled, consumed, or absorbed through wet tissue, like the nose, mouth, or eyes. It causes your voluntary nervous system to go into overdrive, which makes every muscle in your body contract and spasm uncontrollably. These spasms can be strong enough to rip the muscles off your bones. If untreated, death usually comes within 2 to 3 hours either from asphyxiation, your chest muscles spasm so hard your ribs cannot expand, or from sheer exhaustion. There is no antidote to strychnine, although if caught immediately you can be put in sensory deprivation on massive doses of muscle relaxers. If you survive the first 24 hours, you usually live. A friend of mine used to be a crime scene cleanup guy. He was once called in to clean up a car where an infant had been forgotten in a car during the summer in Kansas, where it was well over 100 degrees outside. Cars turn into ovens. He quit after that. Fatal familial insomnia. You slowly lose the ability to sleep and begin to physically and mentally waste away. As someone who suffers from insomnia, it absolutely terrifies me. Not too far from where I used to live, a family all died. What happened was that, on their farm, the fecal lagoon had released a bubble of methane gas. It killed one kid who had wandered nearby. From what I remember, the kid fell into the lagoon, and then each family member tried to get to the kid, and they also were knocked out and fell into the fecal lagoon, where they all drowned. Dean Corll tortured his victims for extended periods of time. Some had glass inserted into their urethra and broken off. He favored little boys. I have seen a video of a man who got his testicles eaten by a pit bull. My cousin's baby starved to death before a year old. She never got comforted, never got any good baby food, she just got born into the world to heroin-addicted parents in a county with poor services, and then she died. I read somewhere, maybe in a book of deaths at the Grand Canyon, about a woman who jumped trying to commit suicide. Unfortunately she survived because she hit a ledge that wasn't quite far enough down to kill her. She had to crawl until she could find another edge to finish the deed. Nelson Mandela's wife tired people, as in she filled a car tire with gasoline and set it on fire while it was around someone's neck. Any degenerative disorder that kills you over the course of years, decades. ALS, muscular dystrophy, cystic fibrosis, Alzheimer's, etc. Everything else here is too fast to be the worst. While on a cherry picker training course we were told a guy once fell out of the basket, didn't have his harness on correctly, and it lacerated his entire ballsack open. He died in hospital soon after because he also tore a major artery in his leg. Don't know how true this is, but it would be a nasty way to go. Not the most horrible way I know or have seen, but still one that I hate to think about. At my local water park, a kid who was 10, same age as me at the time, drowned. Now the way he drowned is when he went down the water slide, and at the end when you slide into a pool there was the pipeline that sucks water back up to the top. Now this pipeline had a grate on it, but it sucked with great force. It used to pull kids towards it as you tried to swim out, and it was kinda a fun game to outswim it. Until one day a kid went under and got held onto the grate of the pipe and could not swim away. He drowned and was only found 20 minutes later when his mom went looking for him. This pipe was probably about 6 meters away from where you slide into the pool. Just the thought of being so small and helpless as you get held under and drown, and just watching other kids land in the pool and swim to safety, all having fun. I don't know, it just gets to me not even being able to call for help when it is so close. Explosive decompression, Byford Dolphin, November 5, 1983. The Byford was a deep-sea driller. There was 4 divers and 2 dive tenders in the diving chamber. The usual decompression and opening procedures were not followed and all the divers and 1 of the tenders were killed. 3 of the divers' bodies were reasonably intact, the 4th was well dismembered and mutilated. Skin of the torso and arms, part if the spinal cord, and 1 leg was the entirety of the body that was intact. No fucking thank you. Drowning. ISIS bound people's hands and feet and put them in cages and slowly lowered them into a body of water. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe.